The desert stretched endlessly, gold and red under the morning light. Dust drifted in slow, tired spirals across the canyon flats as Wyatt Kane rode his mare, boots heavy with the grit of a sleepless night. He wasn't looking for trouble, but in the Arizona Badlands, trouble usually found men like him. The faint sound of iron clinking against rock caught his ear. He reined in his horse, squinting against the glare. That's when he saw her, an Apache woman chained to a wagon post, her face streaked with dust and defiance. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw from struggling against the rusted cuffs that cut deep into her wrists. Wyatt dismounted slowly, his shadow sliding across the dry earth. She watched him like a wolf, cornered but unbroken, eyes burning even through exhaustion. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of blood, iron and sagebrush. Around her lay the remnants of a camp, 3 spent fires, 1 overturned crate and boot prints leading west. Whoever left her here hadn't planned to return. He knelt by the wagon post, his knife catching a glint of sun. The woman stiffened. He didn't say a word, just cut through the first shackle. The chain fell with a dull clang, echoing like judgment in the still morning air. She stumbled back, clutching her wrist, breathing hard. For a moment, Wyatt thought she'd bolt into the open desert, but she stood her ground. "Why?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse. He met her stare, weathered and steady. "Ain't right to let a person die like an animal." His tone carried no pity, only truth. Her jaw tightened, fury flashing behind her eyes. "I'd rather die than be yours," she spat, each word trembling between pride and fear. Wyatt slid his knife back into its sheath, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Then live free. That's all I'm offering," he said, turning to his horse. The wind rose whispering through the mesquite trees like the ghosts of 100 lost stories. She stood uncertain, watching him mount. For a heartbeat, he thought she'd speak again, but she only turned toward the horizon, her chains lying in the dust like the skin of a shed past. Wyatt rode off slow, not looking back, though something in him twisted with unease. The sun climbed higher, painting the canyons in bronze and scarlet. He couldn't shake her face, not the anger, not the strength that looked too proud to survive. Hours later, he stopped at a dry creek bed to water his horse. The reflection in the shallow pool showed his own eyes, weary and older than they should have been. He'd seen too many people broken by the frontier, outlaws, farmers, natives, soldiers, all crushed beneath the same endless sky. But something about that woman lingered, like the echo of a song half forgotten. Freedom meant everything in this land, and he'd just handed hers back to her. Whether she lived or died, that choice was now hers. By dusk, Wyatt set camp near a rock outcrop, firelight flickering against the stone. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, their cries swallowed by the open dark. He poured a cup of coffee from his tin pot, the bitter steam curling into the cool air. For the first time in months, he found himself speaking aloud, not to God, not to anyone in particular. "Maybe I should have kept riding," he muttered. But deep down he knew he couldn't have. The image of her standing barefoot in the sand, proud even in pain, had branded itself into him. The night stretched long and quiet. The stars came out, fierce and countless, hanging like sparks frozen in time. Somewhere out there, that Apache woman was walking free, maybe toward her people, maybe toward nowhere at all. Wyatt didn't know her name, didn't need to, but he felt a strange pull. A reminder that sometimes the West didn't care for reason or logic. Sometimes it only gave you a single moment to decide who you were, the man who turned away, or the one who broke a chain, and in that silent desert, with only the fire for company, Wyatt realized something simple yet unshakable. He hadn't just freed a stranger. He'd freed a part of himself he thought the frontier had long buried. The stars burned brighter, and the wind settled, carrying only the faintest trace of her scent, smoke, dust, and wild sage. He tipped his hat toward the horizon, whispering to no one, "Ride safe, whoever you are." Then he let the night close around him, unaware that destiny was already turning back in his direction. The wind came first, a low, crawling moan that swept across the desert like a warning. Wyatt looked up from his dying campfire as the air turned thick with grit. He pulled his coat tighter and glanced toward the horizon, where the moon had vanished behind a wall of dust. Somewhere beyond that storm, he imagined her walking alone, still half-starved, still proud enough to face the wild on her own. He cursed under his breath and fed the fire another stick, but something in his gut twisted. The desert didn't forgive pride easily. When the first lash of wind hit his face, he heard it again. Faint footsteps behind the hiss of sand. She stepped out of the darkness like a ghost, her hair tangled with wind, her face streaked with dust. Wyatt didn't speak, didn't move. She stood there for a long time, her breath shallow, shoulders drawn tight as if the air itself weighed on her. The blanket he'd left near the saddle was still folded, untouched since morning. He reached for it and held it out, silent. She hesitated, her chin lifting with the same defiance he'd seen when he cut her chains. But her body shook. Lightning cracked overhead, lighting her eyes for an instant, not with rage this time, but something raw. She took the blanket without a word and sank near the fire, her hands trembling. The storm raged around them, a roaring sea of dust and thunder. Wyatt crouched across from her, the flames flickering between them like a living thing. "No one owns you," he said quietly, the words almost lost to the wind. She didn't answer, only stared into the fire, her lips pressed thin. For the first time, he saw the exhaustion etched deep in her face, the kind that came from running, from losing everything worth fighting for. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady. "They killed my brother. Said he stole cattle. He didn't." The wind fell still, as if the desert itself had stopped to listen. Wyatt looked down, jaw tight. "Men like that don't need a reason," he muttered. Hours passed before the storm began to fade. The air smelled of wet dust and smoke, heavy but clean. She lay curled near the fire, the blanket drawn to her chin, eyes half closed. Wyatt sat awake, his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon. In that half-light before dawn, he wondered what kind of man he was. The kind who saved a stranger and sent her away, or the kind who risked everything just to keep her alive. When she stirred, he poured her water from his canteen. "Why do you care?" she asked softly, not quite meeting his gaze. He smiled faintly. "Don't rightly know. Guess I got tired of seeing good people chained to bad luck." She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased, like the edge of a blade dulled by time. When morning came, the desert shone new again, clean, washed by the rain that had followed the storm. They rode side by side, his horse carrying her light frame behind him until the ground grew soft enough for her to walk. She didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't tell her. There was no plan, only the quiet understanding that sometimes survival didn't need direction, only distance. At noon, they stopped by a small ridge overlooking the valley. The river below shimmered like silver glass, winding through the canyons. She touched his arm just once. "I don't know your name," she said. He turned, meeting her eyes. "Wyatt," she nodded. "I'm Ayanna." He repeated it softly, the name lingering on his tongue like a promise. That night, as they camped by the riverbank, the firelight caught in her, hair turning it copper and gold. She spoke little, but her eyes carried a quiet peace he hadn't seen before. "I thought I hated you," she said suddenly, her tone almost curious. Wyatt chuckled. Wouldn't be the first time a woman said that. She looked at him then, not with anger, but with something close to gratitude, though she'd never admit it aloud. The stars burned bright above them, their reflections trembling in the slow-moving river. "You were right," she whispered. "No one owns me." Wyatt nodded, staring into the flames. "And no one owns the desert either." She smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen from her. The wind carried it away like a secret. By dawn, the world was quiet again. The chains that once bound her lay buried under the shifting sands, miles behind them, forgotten by men and time alike. But as Wyatt watched Ayanna standing barefoot by the river, her face lifted to the sun, he knew the West had changed him too. She wasn't his to keep, and maybe that was the point. Freedom was the only thing worth loving out here, and sometimes love itself had to be free to mean anything at all. He saddled his horse, tipped his hat, and when she turned to meet his eyes, there was no need for words. The desert had taken two strangers and burned away everything false, leaving only fire and pride. The first light of dawn touched the canyon walls, turning the red rock gold. Wyatt rode slow, his hat tipped low, dust rising behind his horse's hooves. Ayanna followed beside him, her braid dark against the pale morning. The silence between them was easy now, not the sharp quiet of strangers, but something gentler, like the calm after rain. They didn't look back toward the broken wagon or the scorched trail where their paths had first crossed. The past had burned itself clean. Ahead the land opened wide and endless. The horizon shimmered, promising nothing and everything. Wyatt drew a slow breath. "You ever think about going back?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "There's nothing back there but ghosts." He nodded once. "Then I reckon we keep riding till we find something worth staying for." They reached a stretch of river by midday, the same one that had washed her chains away. The water ran clear and cold, its surface flashing silver under the sun. Ayanna dismounted and knelt at the edge, letting her fingers sink into the current. "In my people's tongue," she said softly, "we call this river Chia. It means forgiveness." Wyatt crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "Reckon I could use some of that." She glanced at him, a smile ghosting across her lips. "You already found it." For a moment neither spoke. Only the river talked, whispering through the reeds, carrying away everything that didn't matter anymore. When she finally rose, her face was turned to the light, and the hardness in her eyes had softened to peace. They made camp beneath a mesquite tree that night, their horses grazing nearby. Wyatt built a small fire and watched her from across the flames. She moved quietly, with the grace of someone who had learned to survive without noise. Her silhouette glowed warm against the firelight, her expression calm, thoughtful. "You never asked where I was headed," she said at last. Wyatt poked the embers with a stick, his voice low. "I didn't figure it was my business," she smiled faintly. "It is now." "I'm going home. There's a canyon north of here. My mother's people once lived there before the soldiers came. I want to see it again." Wyatt stared into the fire for a long while before speaking. "Then I'll take you there." The journey north was rough. They crossed dry riverbeds and narrow passes where the cliffs rose like walls of fire. Some nights they found shelter beneath the stars, sharing coffee and silence. Other nights, thunder rolled through the desert, and they huddled beneath one blanket, the wind howling outside. Each mile stripped something away. The fear, the doubt, the distance. Wyatt found himself learning her stories, of a childhood spent chasing horses, of songs sung in a language older than the land itself, of brothers and fathers lost to war. In return, he told her of his mother's ranch in Texas, of a life traded for quiet roads and open skies. They didn't need to say the word love. It was there, quiet, patient, growing like desert grass after rain. When they finally reached the canyon, the world seemed to stop. The land opened before them, carved deep and red, filled with echoes of the past. Small white flowers grew along the cliffs, bending in the wind like they remembered her. Ayanna dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft earth. "This was my mother's place," she whispered. "She said the wind carried our names so the land would never forget us." Wyatt stood behind her, his hat in his hands, letting the moment belong to her. The sun dipped low, washing the canyon in amber light. "You made it home," he said quietly. She turned to him, eyes shining. "No," she said softly, "we did." As the stars came out, they sat together by a small fire near the canyon rim. The night air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets and the distant cry of a coyote. Wyatt leaned back on his elbows, gazing at the sky. "Funny thing about freedom," he said after a while. "A man spends his whole life chasing it, never realizing it ain't about being alone." Ayanna nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire. "My people used to say, freedom isn't leaving, it's belonging without chains." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "Guess we both had to learn that the hard way." She reached out then, her fingers brushing his. The touch was light, steady, a promise written in silence. By dawn they were still there, side by side, watching the first light spill into the canyon. Ayanna's head rested against his shoulder, her blanket wrapped around them both. Wyatt exhaled, long and slow, feeling the peace of a man who had nothing left to prove. "What now?" he murmured. She smiled without opening her eyes. Now we live. The words were simple, but in that moment they carried the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they'd found. The cowboy, who once freed an Apache woman from her chains, had freed himself too. As the sun rose higher, painting the world in gold, the desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying their story to the horizon, a tale of pride, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be owned to be true.